All right, and then the last thing I want to get into with you guys real quick is the announcements that were made of sports betting in the PLL, and then Pro Lacrosse Talk and Flow Fantasy Lacrosse coming up with the idea of doing fantasy lacrosse for the PLL. Now, obviously, like I said earlier in the show, the three of us are all going to be participating in that fantasy league that I created last week, and then here on the podcast, I'll also be covering both sports betting and fantasy lacrosse on this podcast when it comes time for that later on in July. So with both of these announcements, what are you guys most excited about with each of them?
Oh man. First, new fans, man. Like, there's gonna be, especially with all this baseball crap going on, there's gonna be people who are traditional fantasy baseball fans, fantasy football fans who have nothing to do in that window. Because I don't know if the NFL doesn't start on time. Are we still having fantasy football drafts or whatever? So there's gonna be a gap, right? So many new fans are going to be drawn into this through betting, through fantasy sports, whatever, however it may be. That's what excites me the most. And we finally have a system that makes sense as far as drafting, trades, whatnot. That's unprecedented. And honestly, thinking about it, I didn't think we'd get this far this fast. Like, I
Oh
thought we'd
yeah.
be another 3-4 years out maybe before we got that. I thought maybe it would just take time to get the league established first and all that. But the fact that we have it this early and with this crop of guys, because right now this league is going to be as talented as it's going to get. As it expands, not to say that the talent's going to get any worse, but it's just going to get more spread out.
Yeah.
So it's going to be, right now it's like that prime time for fantasy. And so you're going to see guys that you didn't hear of, like John House, for example, scores 3 goals in a championship game. Who's gonna? I mean, with all due respect, like if I would have been playing fantasy lacrosse last year, I probably wouldn't have started him in my lineup in that championship game. So you're gonna see scenarios like that. Is what's kind of excites me.
What's so exciting to me is, I mean, I don't bet on sports. Never have. If I do, I get revved up too much, and I don't enjoy it the way I like to. But I know a lot of people do bet on sports, and I think adding that level only creates more excitement to the game, and it creates more intensity to the game, and it's going to create more fans. Same sort of thing with fantasy. By having fantasy, you have people that are going to become interested. And one of the coolest things about fantasy, in my opinion, is it makes you familiar with players that you wouldn't otherwise be as familiar with. So if you're a huge diehard fan of Chaos, something like that, and you know Connor Fields, and you know Blaze and Newman, you're familiar with all those guys, well, maybe you're not as familiar with Jackson Place over on Archer, things like that. But now you're going to be forced to become familiar with them, and that's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to create this fan base. It's going to make everyone a little more passionate, right? Because you got people knocking heads a little bit with their team. But one of the best parts is, in my opinion, just taking a step back and seeing what they're doing. With betting and with fantasy and everything else, you're getting more and more of a feeling of having a true professional sport, right?
Yeah.
Lacrosse, we've always had the collegiate level, and we all know college sports are college sports. Then we saw the MLL, and I have respect for the MLL because they started the professional league, right? They really got the things moving a little bit,
Right.
but it felt like they never took that next step to make it feel like a true professional sport. And the PLL with NBC, with the players and creating storylines behind the players, and now we got betting and we got fantasy, it really feels that way. So it's just awesome, man. I think it's awesome for so many reasons, and I'm really stoked that they're doing it.
And shout out to Hutton and Adam over at Pro Lacrosse Talk, because I know they've been working for months trying to.
Yeah.
They
absolutely.
For them to start fantasy lacrosse or working with somebody else, I know they've been working their asses off trying to do that.
Absolutely. And then just real quick before we wrap this thing up, Phil, you mentioned you've never done sports betting or anything like that. I also have never done anything like that, but when it was announced, I started looking into it and kind of researching it a little bit, just trying to study up on it as much as I could because I will do a little bit of it just to kind of say like, hey, I've tried it. And
Yep.
then the other thing is like you mentioned, they're trying to make this as much of a professional league as it can possibly be. And I remember when they first announced that the PLL was going to become a thing back about a year and a half ago or so now. Paul Rabel even said that they want this to eventually, whenever it gets to this point, they want it to eventually become an actual full-time thing for these players so that they can actually be full-time professional lacrosse players and they don't have to necessarily be, like we've talked about throughout this episode, collegiate coaches, or maybe they run their own like positional academies and things like that, like I know guys like Greg Gorenly and do too.
Absolutely, man. And, you know, I know a player that went to an Ivy League school and actually turned down jobs to play in the PLL. And it's so cool to see, like you said, these guys become full-time players. You don't see guys in other professional sports, even, you know, soccer or anything like that. You don't see those guys saying, yeah, you know, I play on whatever it is, Galaxy, or I'm not as familiar with those teams, but whatever it is. But, yeah, I'm also an accountant on the side. you know, you don't see that. And so,
thing, that is something that's, I think, if a guy wants to be a full-time lacrosse player and maybe an assistant coach, like that's something that we should try and keep in some way. Because that makes it unique to lacrosse and the college game. Because you imagine being a high school commit or being a 21, 22 right now and saying, oh, yeah, my coach denounced, he's recruiting me at Duke and he plays and I get to watch him on Saturdays. Like, that makes the college game that much better and in turn puts more eyes on the Chrome because that kid's going to go to school and be like, hey, my college coach right there, he's a professional athlete too, you know? So, like, that part of it too.
For sure. And some of these guys, I'm sure, want to have that job on the side because it gives them that stability or just kind of is more of a mental thing that makes you feel good. And then plus, to have that ability to start becoming a professional, a true professional athlete, work out all off season, things like that. It's awesome that Rabel is doing that. And as far as the betting goes, I'll look into it. I like to see the odds. I like to give people my thought process on who I think's going to win, what the better bet is. But whether or not I'll put money down, we'll see.
Yeah, once you start, it's like once you put in that first few bucks, and then it's like, no, you got to stop yourself. Like.
All right, well, as somebody that's never actually done it before, that's probably a good thing that I'll have to keep in mind. But yeah, that'll pretty much do it for this episode 21 of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. You guys can check out the podcast on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, or you can search for it on SoundCloud, YouTube, and now Podchaser. I just added that one to the list as well just the other day, so you guys can check it out there when it's up and posted over the next few days. Phil, Jordan, thank you guys so much for joining me on this episode as my first ever guests here. We'll talk to you guys later.
Thanks so much, man. Thanks for having me.
Yep, thanks, guys.